At this very moment, a 154-foot United States Coast Guard cutter is patrolling Bahamian waters. On board, specialized divers prepare to plunge into the Sea of Abaco. But they are not searching this specific area because a witness suddenly came forward. No one confessed to a crime, and they are not chasing any of those wild rumors circulating online. According to multiple sources, investigators managed to pull GPS data directly from one of Brian Hooker's electronic devices. That data allegedly revealed a path that does not match the story he told about the night Lynette Hooker vanished. More importantly, investigators believe that device pinpoints a highly specific spot in the Sea of Abaco, one significant enough to launch a federal dive recovery mission. Let that sink in. A missing person investigation, sparked by a husband claiming his wife was lost at sea, has escalated. Now, federal authorities are deploying specialized assets to search a location identified through digital forensics. The most critical questions in this mysterious disappearance might no longer be resolved by simple witness statements. They might be answered by raw data. Today, we will trace how investigators moved from Brian Hooker's original story on April 4, 2026, to a high-stakes search focused on one exact coordinate in the deep water. We will break down exactly what was reported, what investigators did next, and why this breakthrough could change everything in the Lynette Hooker case. Before we go any further, remember that this remains an active, ongoing investigation involving a missing woman. Some details discussed in this video may be unsettling to some. Viewer discretion is highly advised. With federal divers actively searching a coordinate tied directly to Brian Hooker's device, the real question is no longer whether police have a fresh lead. The question is what they expect to find down there. The driving force behind this entire search boils down to one critical piece of evidence.
Not an eyewitness, not a confession, but a device. Multiple reports state investigators pulled GPS tracking data from Brian Hooker's personal electronics.
What that location data allegedly revealed has become the most critical turning point in this entire mystery. Investigators claim the device quietly recorded movements on the night Lynette Hooker vanished. Movements that reportedly contradict the story Brian Hooker gave to police. That is where this investigation takes a dramatic turn, because he did not just tell authorities what happened. He walked them through it. He described exactly where he and Lynette had been and the route they took. He detailed how Lynette allegedly went overboard during their crossing and what he did right afterward. For weeks, that story sat at the absolute center of the case. Then, investigators extracted GPS coordinates that told a completely different story. According to sources close to the case, the device tracked movement out on the water during the night of April 4, 2026. But what grabbed the attention of investigators was not just that the device was active, it was where it traveled and where it stopped. According to CBS News, investigators found that the device traveled deep into the Sea of Abaco, paused at a specific spot, and later returned. That key piece of information gave authorities a far more precise search zone than they ever had. Think about the weight of that for a moment. For weeks, recovery efforts relied solely on a vague overboard location and a story told after Lynette had already vanished. Now, investigators reportedly have something different, a hard digital record, a tracking history created in real time that does not depend on memory.
A data point that cannot change. And according to police, that record points directly to a spot they believe warrants a much closer look.
The question is why? Why would his device travel to a location that investigators now find so critical? Why stop there? And why, according to active reports, did it head back? Those questions are now at the very heart of the investigation. Because investigators do not view this as some random coordinate in the water, the GPS evidence was compelling enough that American authorities cleared a new search operation with the Bahamas inside the Sea of Abaco. Specialized Coast Guard teams and deep-sea divers were deployed to sweep areas they had never searched before. That kind of operation does not happen over a minor discrepancy. It happens when investigators believe a clue will lead them directly to answers. That is what makes this breakthrough so massive. The GPS logs did not just raise questions. Instead of calculating where Lynette Hooker might have drifted, investigators shifted focus entirely to where that device actually traveled. And according to reports, those two paths do not match up. If Brian Hooker's account was accurate, then why does the device allegedly show a different route? Why is the focus of investigators now locked on a spot that was never in his original story? To understand why that discrepancy matters, we have to go back to the beginning and re-examine the timeline handed to investigators the night Lynette Hooker vanished.
To understand why this GPS data is so critical,
We must look closely at the initial story investigators were told, because for weeks, every lead in this case was viewed through that exact lens. According to Brian Hooker, the chain of events started on the evening of April 4, 2026. At roughly 7:30 p.m., Brian and Lynette Hooker left the shore near Hopetown in an 8-foot hard-bottom dinghy. Their destination was their sailboat, the Soulmate, anchored off Elbow Cay as their full-time home. What happened during that short trip is the ultimate mystery of this entire case. Brian told authorities that the water was incredibly rough. During the crossing, he claims Lynette fell overboard. In his version of events, she was holding the key needed to run the dinghy's motor. When she fell overboard, that key supposedly went with her, instantly killing the engine. Right then, in Brian's telling, the entire situation changed. He claimed to investigators that he simply could not get the small boat restarted. He claimed the currents swept Lynette away before he could reach her. Left with a dead engine, he was supposedly stranded, drifting out in the pitch black. That story became the core of the entire case. A horrible accident, a woman lost overboard, a dead motor, and a husband stranded alone after watching his wife vanish into the dark. Brian claimed he spent the next several hours just fighting to survive. He said he drifted and paddled through the Sea of Abaco all night, finally scraping ashore at Marsh Harbor in the early morning of April 5th. Police report he landed around 4 a.m. and only then reported his wife missing. At first glance, his story offered detectives a very simple explanation for why she vanished. If she fell into rough, pitch-black water, search and rescue would naturally focus on wind drift, strong currents, and her last known location. That was exactly where the search began, but detectives quickly ran into one major problem. The entire search area rested on a single massive assumption that Brian's timeline and route were completely true. Because if that small boat did not go where they thought, if the route or the timeline was off, then the whole theory about what happened on April 4th completely falls apart. And that is exactly why the GPS tracking data became so critical. Once detectives started comparing the digital records with the story they had been told, they reportedly uncovered something that demanded a much deeper look. The deeper detectives looked into Brian Hooker's story, the more one burning question took center stage.
Did the drift theory really explain their movements that night? Remember, the distance Brian described traveling after she supposedly fell overboard was not small at all.
He was talking about hours lost at sea.
He claimed that after the motor died, he drifted in the dark before finally reaching Marsh Harbor on the morning of April 5th. On paper, that story sounds simple enough. In reality, the actual geography of the Sea of Abaco makes things far more complicated. It is not some tiny, sheltered harbor. This is a massive body of open water lying between the Abaco Islands and the mainland. Wind, heavy currents, tides, and poor visibility all play major roles when trying to reconstruct a nighttime maritime incident, and that is exactly what investigators set out to do.
If a vessel is truly drifting, marine experts expect to see very specific patterns. When a boat loses power and drifts, its movements must match the local winds and currents. The water's direction dictates exactly where it goes. More than anything, the exact timeline has to make sense. That is why detectives did not just accept Brian's version of his route. They needed to see if physical evidence backed up his claims. Then they got the GPS data. Sources close to the case report that the device showed clear movement out on the water, a sudden stop, and then a return trip. This new data was so significant that police immediately scheduled a targeted dive search. This detail changes everything, because a deliberate pause is not a drift. A stop implies intent, a specific destination or coordinate. Reports indicate that this location was critical enough for investigators to ask Bahamian officials for permission to launch a fresh underwater search. The tracking data did not just show where the boat had traveled. It completely shattered the working theory of what happened the night she vanished. For weeks, the case revolved around a simple overboard accident and the tragic theory that she was swept away.
Now, detectives had hard data pointing them in a totally different direction. That shift is massive.
Every missing person search begins with basic assumptions. Where did they fall? Which way did the water carry them?
How far could they drift? What areas are high priority? When those initial theories shift,
the entire case shifts too, and that is exactly what happened here.
This new search zone was no random guess. Detectives targeted the area after analyzing digital data pulled from electronic devices.
But the questions went far beyond the tracking data. Actually, they were just getting started. As detectives kept digging, they realized they had to look at more than just boat movements. The digital footprint was not the only red flag. By the time Brian reached the harbor, he had allegedly been out on the water for hours. It was a wild story from the start. A woman supposedly falls overboard at sunset. The engine dies, and the boat cannot be restarted. Then, he supposedly drifts through pitch-black water for hours before finally hitting the shoreline.
But once detectives started scrutinizing the timeline, their focus shifted entirely to his actions after he landed.
See, unlike the tracking records showing movements at sea, the dock timeline captured something far more telling: behavior. Reports indicate Brian pulled into the Marsh Harbor Marina around 4 a.m. on April 5th. The first witness to see him was night security guard Edward Smith. Smith later said a coworker warned him that some guy had arrived, rambling about a key and a woman. The man in question was Brian Hooker. Smith recalled him being utterly exhausted and dehydrated, constantly begging for water.
When asked about Lynette's whereabouts, Smith recalled a chillingly simple reply: "She is in the water." By then, almost 9 hours had slipped away since she allegedly went overboard.
That timeline discrepancy immediately bothered Smith. During later interviews, he raised the exact same question that would soon haunt everyone following this investigation.
If Lynette fell overboard around 7:18 p.m., why did it take until 4:08 a.m. for Brian to finally make landfall and report the tragedy? According to Smith, Brian claimed powerful gusts drifted him far off course, leaving him utterly blind in the pitch-black night. He also maintained that he fired off 2 emergency flares, yet no passing vessels ever spotted or answered them. Back then, detectives were forced to rely almost entirely on Brian's solo narrative.
But as the inquiry deepened, those missing hours grew critical. The boatyard ceased to be just a landing spot. It became an unshakable anchor in the digital timeline. A benchmark investigators could measure against everything else: his stated route, his drift story, and the changing winds. They weighed his story against digital evidence, eventually cross-referencing it with the hard GPS coordinates. According to Smith, authorities showed up around 5 a.m. and questioned Brian for hours. When Smith clocked out at 7 a.m., the police were still there. This particular gap in the timeline does not actually prove anything on its own. His intense exhaustion was certainly not direct evidence of foul play. His desperate plea for water is not evidence of a crime, nor is his willingness to explain the tragic accident. But experienced detectives never look at clues in isolation. They study how these scattered pieces connect. And once the digital tracking data surfaced, the police suddenly had a massive advantage they lacked in those chaotic first days: an objective digital trail, a record to test against his spoken narrative. That is when the timing at the boatyard became absolutely critical, because if the GPS coordinates truly charted his path that night, detectives would be forced to ask a troubling new question. When Brian landed at Marsh Harbor and told his tale, did his story match the cold, hard trail left in the digital record? Or was there a gap between truth and fiction? That query became the focal point as the criminal case began taking shape. And as the probe deepened, detectives began listening to the voices that had voiced suspicions from the very start. Weeks before authorities secured the satellite tracking data, key individuals were already doubting his story. These were not seasoned detectives or tech experts, but distraught family members, led by Lynette's outspoken daughter, Carly Aylesworth. Directly after her mother vanished, Aylesworth began voicing loud doubts about the official narrative, though she never claimed to have all the answers. She was not pushing some alternative theory. She just wanted a thorough, unbiased investigation. Her warnings turned heads for a simple reason. She knew these people intimately. She knew their habits, their quirks, and their daily routines. According to several interviews, parts of the narrative immediately felt wrong to her. The biggest red flag was the key to the dinghy. In Brian Hooker's version, Lynette fell overboard while holding the ignition key clipped to the safety lanyard, instantly killing the boat's engine. Yet Aylesworth openly doubted this. In media interviews, she noted that Brian was almost always the one piloting the watercraft. If he was steering, she asked, why on earth would Lynette have the safety key? It proved nothing on its own.
But it was the very first crack in a story that her relatives could not accept. And then, another issue surfaced. If Lynette truly went missing around dusk and Brian survived till morning, why did things play out the way they did?
Suspicion grew as the rescue effort widened. Then, a voice message came to light. This recording would be the first public communication from Brian after her disappearance.
According to major news reports from the time, Brian had left a recorded message for Carly Aylesworth. In this voicemail, he claimed that rescue teams had recovered a life jacket he supposedly threw to her when she fell. He suggested that searchers could finally narrow down their grid. Taken alone, this voicemail seemed completely normal. Just a grieving relative sharing updates. But with dark clouds already gathering over his story, that audio was analyzed line by line.
Every syllable mattered. Every single word was weighed.
Because by then, the family was desperate to piece together those lost hours on April 4th. As time passed, Carly kept speaking out. She painted her mother as a skilled sailor and strong swimmer, someone intimately familiar with the sea.
She constantly demanded real facts, not convenient assumptions. What made her concerns impossible to ignore was that they did not surface months down the line.
They surfaced right away, even as rescue crews actively searched the ocean for Lynette. Detectives were still collecting clues, desperately trying to reconstruct a reliable timeline of events. But behind closed doors, investigators were building something far more damning than mere gossip or family suspicion. They were quietly compiling a massive digital forensic profile, one that stretched far beyond basic GPS coordinates. By now, authorities possessed much more than a suspect's story or family doubts. They had hard satellite data pointing directly to a spot in the Sea of Abaco. Multiple reports suggest that investigators had quietly begun digging through a mountain of digital evidence tied directly to the vessel itself. Individually, these details might seem like minor glitches, but when pieced together, investigators likely began to see a far more troubling picture. Take the Soulmate, for instance. The sailboat Lynette and Brian Hooker called home was packed with systems that constantly spat out data. This was not just a simple boat. It was a floating web of electronics, linking navigation gear, communications, power grids, and constant internet connectivity. And reports suggest investigators began picking those systems apart, piece by piece.
First up was the vessel's Automatic Identification System, or AIS. It is built to broadcast a boat's exact location and movement.
It tells other vessels, port authorities, and maritime trackers exactly where a boat is and where it is heading. Yet, according to case reports, those AIS broadcasts from the Soulmate suddenly went dark right during a critical window in the timeline. That blackout happened the night Lynette vanished, a detail the New York Post pointed out as a major focus for the active police investigation. Alone, that silence proves nothing. Electronic systems crash, power switches get flipped, gear fails all the time. But detectives were not just looking at one glitch. They were mapping out the entire digital footprint. And then came the power logs.
According to leaked files, the Soulmate's electrical records allegedly flagged some highly unusual spikes during the exact hours under intense police scrutiny.
Specifically, Fox News reports highlighted an unexpected electrical surge on the boat during a window of time that investigators were meticulously dissecting. Again, an electrical surge on its own proves little. But detectives were not treating these anomalies as random accidents. They were asking a much deeper question.
How do these pieces connect? Next up was the internet data.
Reports reveal that authorities also dug deep into logs from the yacht's Starlink internet terminal.
Those files allegedly showed active devices communicating with the network during the very hours detectives were trying to account for.
Fox News detailed this exhaustive digital forensic analysis. It matters because technology does what human witnesses cannot. It leaves an unbreakable trail of timestamps.
Every login, every ping, every surge, every movement, all building a timeline. And timelines are where police cases either solidify or completely unravel.
At its core, the investigation is trying to solve one basic puzzle. Does this digital trail actually back up the official story they were told? Or does it point somewhere else entirely? This is where the GPS tracking becomes absolutely critical. The silent AIS, the power spikes, the network pings, the GPS coordinates. Detectives were no longer treating these clues as separate events. They were layering them on top of each other, looking for alignments, looking for patterns, looking for lies. When several independent systems log data on the same night, police can rebuild the scene with far more accuracy than fragile human memory allows. If one system raises a red flag, detectives look to the others for answers.
That seems to be exactly what unfolded in this case.
The GPS track apparently led searchers straight to a spot in the Sea of Abaco, while boat logs raised serious doubts about the timeline.
Starlink logs filled in even more blank spaces. Together, these pieces began weaving a picture that investigators simply could not look away from. It was a story told not by a single witness, but by multiple systems screaming the same thing. At this point, police had shifted focus from just where Lynette vanished.
They were locked on to a different goal. Did the digital forensics actually match the story they were given?
As that forensic puzzle came together, authorities made one of the most aggressive moves in the entire mystery. They seized the boat itself. By late May and early June, this high-stakes probe entered a completely different phase.
Until then, detectives had been quietly gathering files, conducting interviews, and dissecting the digital footprints left behind on various devices. Now they were on the move. Reports revealed that GPS tracking had finally handed investigators the one thing they lacked: an exact location. Not a massive grid, not a wild guess, but a pinpoint spot in the Sea of Abaco that was too critical to ignore.
This shift changed everything. For weeks, search teams had only looked where Lynette was supposedly lost at sea.
But sources close to the case say fresh GPS data revealed boat movements that completely contradicted Brian Hooker's original story.
Even more crucial, the coordinates pointed to spots that divers had never explored before.
Once detectives saw those maps, the entire investigation escalated.
United States federal agents requested emergency approval to launch a search in Bahamian waters. That was a massive step. The Sea of Abaco is outside American jurisdiction.
Deploying American assets abroad demands close coordination and a green light from local authorities. Reports say that clearance was quickly given. Within days, specialized Coast Guard vessels began arriving on the scene.
Among them was the cutter Margaret Norville, dropping anchor near Elbow Cay. Specialized recovery divers and support crews were deployed to scan the depths of these new, highly specific coordinates.
Think about what that actually means for this investigation. Federal investigators do not deploy specialized search teams based on a mere hunch.
To launch a search this massive, investigators need solid ground to believe evidence is actually there. And according to multiple reports, that crucial lead came directly from the GPS data.
This specific search zone was only about 25 feet deep, not hundreds of feet down and not miles offshore. It was shallow enough for divers to scan the bottom while investigators deployed advanced sonar tech to assist them. Reports suggest the team also brought in a remotely operated underwater vehicle, commonly called an ROV, to assist.
That is critical, because an ROV can scan the ocean floor in ways human divers simply cannot. They map, record, and analyze target zones with absolute precision.
Which raises a glaring question. What exactly were they hoping to find? Officials are keeping tight-lipped about the details, but reports say the mission was to find Lynette Hooker, or any physical clue explaining what happened on the night of April 4, 2026. And that is precisely where this phase of the case gets incredibly intense.
Because this was no random search. They were not just blind sweeping the vast waters of the Sea of Abaco.
They targeted a highly specific spot flagged by digital forensics, a place where a device suddenly went dark. A spot so vital that detectives returned to search it weeks after Lynette vanished. The big question is, why? What did that GPS tracking show that demanded such a massive response? What made them believe this specific spot held the answers that previous search teams had missed? Because while divers searched those Bahamian waters, detectives back on land were dissecting another massive piece of the puzzle, the boat itself. And their next move would prove exactly how much weight they were giving to the digital clues they uncovered. By June 2026, the search for Lynette Hooker boiled down to two critical things: a precise coordinate and the digital trail that pointed them there. Sending divers into the Sea of Abaco was easily the most significant breakthrough since Lynette vanished on April 4th. Reports show specialized Coast Guard teams focused on a tight coordinate extracted directly from recovered GPS tracking data. This tactical dive marked a massive pivot from the wide, desperate search efforts seen early in the case. But whether those divers found what they needed is still unknown. Authorities are keeping the results of the dive under wraps.
They are keeping the finest details of this investigation entirely secret.
And we still do not know the full scope of the digital data that led them to this spot.
What is certain is that this active investigation shows no signs of slowing down.
Because while divers scoured the seabed, detectives were simultaneously targeting another massive piece of evidence, the Soulmate, the sailboat at the very center of this mystery. Reports confirmed that the Coast Guard Investigative Service seized the vessel as part of their active investigation.
Seizing a vessel is no routine chore. This move proves just how vital detectives believe the boat is to cracking the case. It suggests the boat itself holds crucial physical evidence, and the forensic sweep of the Soulmate is far from finished. Experts are dissecting the boat's navigation systems, electronic logs, radios, and every scrap of digital data they can pull from the ship. Reports also highlight an onboard infrared camera, which forensic specialists are currently analyzing for any hidden clues. That matters because modern cases are built by connecting dozens of tiny, fragmented pieces of data. GPS coordinates, power logs, network pings, and surveillance footage. Alone, each clue tells only a fraction of the story. Together, they build a timeline, and timelines make lies incredibly difficult to maintain. What stands out here is that detectives are not leaning on just one piece of the puzzle. Instead, they are cross-referencing separate digital networks against the story they were first told, testing GPS records, vessel logs, and dive results. Every new detail brings them closer to answering one key question. What happened to Lynette Hooker on April 4th, 2026?
Which brings us to where this active probe stands right now.
Detectives now possess something they completely lacked in those chaotic early days. They have a highly specific coordinate, pinpointed entirely by digital forensic data.
A target vital enough to warrant a massive federal dive operation.
Whether this coordinate yields the truth remains to be seen, but we cannot ignore how massive this shift is. A case that began as a simple missing person at sea has completely transformed. It is now a high-tech forensic hunt. Detectives are tracing a digital trail that recorded everything, long before anyone realized it would become key evidence in a criminal case.
A trail frozen in data. A trail they are determined to follow to the very end. But here is the most fascinating part of this mystery. Witnesses can forget. Memories fade and stories shift over time. But digital data does not care about alibis. It only records the cold facts. Now, investigators must determine if these silent digital records hold the final missing piece of the puzzle.
And whether locked deep within that data lies the absolute truth about what happened to Lynette Hooker.